Hi, I'm Regan Robinson, your host of Future Fit, the only podcast unraveling the secrets of how the world's most innovative leaders stay future ready in a fast-paced world. I've spent over 20 years as a futurist and strategist, transforming top global brands and putting investment-backed startups on paths to sustainable growth. Along the way, I've become obsessed with new ways to prepare for the future, because thinking about the long term once a year simply isn't enough. In each episode, I talk with movers, shakers, and path breakers who share their stories about how they turn uncertainty into their strategic advantage. Throughout our journey, we'll discover unconventional and imaginative ways to help you thrive today while leading your teams into tomorrow. Future Fit leaders know that being prepared for what's next is more than a business decision. It's a way of being. Let's venture together as we co-create a new future readiness playbook. The future can't wait, and neither can I. So, are you ready to get future fit? So today I am thrilled to welcome Mark Miller, an innovative leader that's worked for more than 20 years in the communication industry and has become a go-to strategist for global brands seeking enduring relevance. Mark uncovers insights and translates strategic ideas into something useful for product design, service approach, and creative application, and is the Chief Strategy Officer at Team One. Team One was founded with a philosophical focus to construct brands of elevated aspiration and worth by attracting affluent consumers like never before, and has worked with the likes of Legacies, Marriott International Luxury Brands, and The RealReal. Mark is also the founder of the Legacy Lab, Team One's thought leadership and consulting practice that explores how to build lasting legacy, and he's the co-author of Legacy in the Making, Building a Long-Term Brand to Stand Out in a Short-Term World. Mark is also a sought-after presenter, keynote speaker, and panelist on global luxury and premium brands, leadership culture and legacy making, and his writing has been featured in Inc. magazine, Fast Company, Dow Jones Market Watch, and many more. Mark focuses on what distinguishes long-term brand builders from their short-lived peers. And so I am incredibly excited to hear what he's going to enlighten us with today. Welcome to Future Fit, Mark.
Thank you, Regan.
Excited to have you here. So let's begin our adventure together with the question that I love to ask all of my guests, which is, what does future ready mean to you?
I really love that question. It reminds me that at a point in time in the not too distant past, one of the common refrains in our neck of the woods and in our business was clients and brands talking about being future proof. And the reason I find that such an interesting point of contrast is the world has changed sufficiently, and we've been through enough extremes that leaders of brands and brands themselves recognize that the ambition to be future proof is nearly impossible, but being future ready, being able to anticipate what might be ahead and having plans and strategies to adapt for them makes all the sense in the world. One of the analogies that we often share is if you were in a boat in the middle of the ocean and a gust of wind came along, there's a point of view that says if you don't know where you're going, then you'll just get out of the way because all you're thinking about is survival in the moment. And then what happens next seems like entirely left to chance. But the ones who have more of a sense of where they're heading over a lifetime, the ones who are more future ready, not only get out of the way and then start again, they get out of the way with a sense of where they're going next. And so, well, counterintuitive, our perspective is the ones who think long-term in a short-term world, the ones who are actually future ready, are the ones who embrace the idea that long-term thinking is, in fact, the best short-term strategy.
I love that. And so much of what you just said really resonates with me. And well, first of all, I love a good sailing and navigation metaphor. So I use a lot of those in my work. And I also am incredibly intentional about not using the word future proof, because I agree. It indicates that you are proof from the future, job done, it's over. Right. And so the reason that, and that's not true today, that is impossible. And so that's why my show is actually called Future Fitness, because yet another metaphor is I am trying to help people understand that being future ready is actually a level of fitness. that we all need to cultivate. It's a capacity and a capability. It is not a one and done or an annual activity that you check off your list. And it is something that everyone can build, which is part of what makes it so amazing, is everyone with the right tools and the right intentions and all of this stuff. The opportunity is for the taking for everyone, but it is a mindset and it is a way of being. And so I think your description of what future ready means to you it really aligns with my thinking.
Yeah, I love the way you look at it as a mindset versus there's a rule book or a playbook that says if you just do these things and only these things, you're certain to get to the destination. But if you embrace these ideas and ideals as a way to navigate through the world, I love your framework of it. It's about being more fit to move through it, to be better and stronger as you move through it. I like that a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you have to be fit in every way, mentally, physically, emotionally, financially. And I'm talking about in a personal context, as well as with your company. And so this is why I use a lot of health metaphors in my work as well, is because I'm trying to help people understand that not only does it apply to you and your teams and your employees, but it actually look at your company as a living and breathing person, as a human, right? And so there are fitness levels, future ready fitness levels that actually is a macro horizontal way of looking at how you can strategize and grow your company. And by having a strong fit foundation, that gives you the capacity. Now, there's a capability aspect. You do need to have methodologies, intellectual property, tools, those things as well. But really, if you start with this foundation of fitness, then that is what empowers you to be fit to face whatever the future is going to throw at you, right?
We are like-minded in how we look at the world.
We are indeed. So I would love to talk a bit about legacy building and mindsets. Speaking of mindsets, so research indicates that there are about 1,000 US companies that are at least 100 years old as of 2023. Now, to understand how unique that is, that's only about 8% in the US reach that milestone. 0.8, not 8%, 0.8. So it's not even 1%. Let me correct. I get so excited, I can't even read my numbers. Meanwhile, as of 2020, Japan has 33,000 companies, at least a century old. Very interesting, right? And I thought you'd get excited about this. And you wrote that adapting and thriving will take more than lifting our collective gaze from the unhealthy focus on short-term profits. And it'll require leaders thinking about building legacies and not just near-term resumes. And this really deeply resonates with me because it speaks to the core of the problem. How we live and work is broken. Now, there are infrastructure issues, there are funding issues. Yes, all that is true. But at the end of the day, it is a cultural issue because the culture of Japan is very different than the culture that we have here in the US. And so while my statement, the way that we live and work is broken, that is meaty, that is bold, and that would probably require a 6-hour show to unpack, let's hone in on one specific part of that, which is how can leaders begin shifting their mindsets and focus towards legacy building? And maybe what are some hurdles or challenges that could arise along the way?
Sure. I'll back up for a moment and share part of what motivated my interest in the topic. There was a professional reason and there was a personal reason. And part of what motivated me to explore this personally was there was a point in time where I was about to become a dad for the very first time. I was a short-term thinker. I focused very much on my career. I focused very much on building my resume. I understand there are others who do that. And I'm not saying that is, it's right for some people and it isn't right for others. I came to a point in my life where I want to set a different kind of example, recognizing that I was about to be a dad. I didn't want my daughter to come home one day and ask why I was spending all this time at work and spending less time with family. And was that time well spent? And did it matter or did it not matter? I felt like I needed to answer those questions for myself so that one day I could answer that for her. And so I went down the path of speaking to leaders of brands, founders of brands, refounders of brands, who were building things that I'd admired tremendously, and was very fortunate to be able to gain access to some very special people and some very special stories to learn from them. And I certainly walked away with the sense that there was a mindset, maybe less a set of hard and fast rules, but a sense of principles that helped to guide these founders and their businesses to thrive at a time when others were dissipating. They do have a more long-term predisposition. The way they look at legacy is not just in the rearview mirror. It's not something that just gets judged at the end of 100 years or later on in an organization's life. They look at legacy making as something that's intentionally built each and every day. And there were 5 principles of this mindset that really stood out to us that we wrote about in our book. And they go like this. The first is the ones who build things that last tend to take leadership very personally. I think the old paradigm was we would say, business is for business and keep your personal passions and interests out of the workplace. You spend your time doing that separately. But the people we were meeting were very intentional about saying they started a business to solve a problem they had, or they started a business to put something in greater abundance in the world that was otherwise in limited supply. So they didn't separate personal things from professional things. They actually resolved the paradox by taking their leadership and their work very personally. Mm-hmm. Second thing that we learned about the mindset is there's no shortage of organizations that have the right taglines, slogans, manifestos, T-shirts that all say the right things. And yet when times go to bad, we see that these very leaders and organizations and brands don't live up to the things that they told us they would. They become more self-interested. Yeah. They do the opposite of what they say they can do. But the ones who build things that last in good times or bad don't just say the right words, they behave their beliefs.
Yeah.
The third thing that we learned was they don't just treat customers as transactors. They don't just treat them as retail targets. They bring them into their brand. They treat them like stakeholders and co-owners and co-investors and co-collaborators. They treat outsiders like insiders. The fourth of 5 things that they do is they don't just aim to be the best at what they do and incrementally better. They aim to create things that are fundamentally innovative and different. And then finally, they don't just rest on their laurels by having done something exceptional at one point in time. They have a predisposition to creating a legacy each and every day.
I love all that. That's so powerful. I mean, all 5 of those lessons, I think, for our audience listening are great takeaways in terms of mindset shifts, whether it's different ways to look at your customers, different ways to even look at the work that you're doing every day by making it meaningful and personal. You know, the other thing that's kind of coming up for me, which those who listen to the show know this is a big bugaboo of mine. I have lots of old lady words like bugaboo, but, you know, one of the biggest challenges I see with sort of this longer term mindset is fear, ego, and complacency, which you sort of touched on, right? What I tend to remind leaders is, listen, you know, data shows while you can make money off a declining business model for years, data shows that once a company runs up against a major stall in its growth, it only has a 10% chance of ever fully recovering. I mean, talk about mic drop. And so I love how you talked about the intentionality and how this is something that is done every day. And I think that's why that's so powerful is, yes, I mean, the world is complex. Everybody has a lot going on. You know, this work is not for the faint of heart. It can feel very overwhelming, but if people understand that it's not like, oh, legacy building. It's like I'm sitting on a mountain, you know, after I've passed on wherever I go and I like looking down from wherever I am, depending on your beliefs. But no, these are small, incremental, little steps, changes, habits, rituals, ways of seeing the world, ways of being, ways of moving through the world, ways of leading that you can cultivate, right? And learn. Yes. Right. And practice every day. And guess what? It's going to take a while. And that's okay. Right.
And that's okay. And I think that's what's important. That it's good to embrace the idea that things take time. It's not uncommon that we'll meet leaders of organizations where in response to the question, what are you trying to achieve? The answer is a financial reality. Yeah. My education involves having us studied and graduated from business school. Certainly one of the first lessons they taught us is the responsibility of an organization is to maximize revenue shareholder. It was a financial goal in pursuit. And when we saw the kinds of leaders that were being celebrated on the covers of famous magazines for a very long period of time, they were the people where the headline was, they've made their millions of dollars or they made their billions of dollars. And that was the thing that many aspired to. And I think that really is a difference, which is, this isn't a conversation about choose to make money or choose to make a difference. I have a real interest in those leaders and organizations who say, in making a contribution to culture and society and making a contribution to something I care about, I can also create revenue and profitability along the way, which is important because you can grow businesses, you can pay salaries, you can pay healthcare benefits. These aren't people who have a disdain for making money. They just don't start with the first thing they want to do is make $1 billion. They think about the contribution they want to make larger than that.
Yeah, well, I think that's really important. It's interesting. This is something that surprised me. I was listening to a pod interview with this gentleman named John Rossman, who worked at Amazon, and he wrote this book called The Amazon Way. And the thing that surprised me is he was actually talking about the long trajectory of Amazon. And there was a time that people tend to not remember where their stock was low, where it was flat, right? And what he said was that when like the company was very intentional at the time, even though they were listed on the stock exchange, that they would not give guidance to analysts on purpose so that it wouldn't be judged on the kind of quarter to quarter hamster wheel that so many companies get into. And that, I mean, that actually knocked my proverbial socks off when I heard that, because I'm like, okay, there's evidence of like, and someone who's quite successful, right? And of like saying no. Now, granted, you could argue that he's in a position of power, but this is not a show about that. Like, can everybody do that? But maybe everybody can. Anything is possible. And if he, Bezos was like, no, we're not going to play your game. This is a long-term play. Right? Why can't other company like that should make people feel like they have more agency, whether they're listed on the stock market or not?
Certainly one of the questions we get, I'm sure you do as well, is even if I sign up for this way of thinking emotionally or philosophically, how do I persuade my organization? How do I persuade the people who work for me? How do I persuade the people who give funding that this isn't just something that makes us feel good, but it actually drives good business? And so it's every combination of success stories like the one that you shared and creating metrics that allow us to say there's proof and evidence that this way of thinking isn't just a spiritually nice thing to do, but really good for business. All those stories make a meaningful difference, I think, to inspire other people to want to live and work the same way. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. And one other point I want to make before we move on is, to me, building a legacy requires reimagining on the daily, right? Whether it's dismantling outdated systems, questioning industry norms, or being willing to upset shareholders, in the case of Amazon, in the service of a long-term vision. And the question isn't just how can I create something that lasts, but what am I willing to change? Or, I mean, I don't like words like destroy and disrupt. I try to avoid aggro language like that. But really, what am I willing to reimagine or evolve or reinvent that while still building a foundation that truly endures?
One of my favorite brands to talk about is a brand called Taylor Guitars. And this year, Taylor Guitars is celebrating their 50th milestone. We write about them in the book for those who are interested. But I'd encourage you, if you find the story interesting, to go do your own research. There's plenty to read about them, and they're a wonderful company. And one of the co-founders has a really great expression and or quote that has stayed with me. And he says, when confronted with every difficult decision, they ask themselves, in 10 years' time, will they be happy they made the choice? And if they can answer that in 10 years' time, they'll be happy they made the choice for the betterment of their company, their workers, the business they're building. Then they're willing to make decisions today that help them get there, even if that requires difficult decisions. And as you shared, it's just a rare point of view. When people are in their jobs for 1, 2, and 3 years, they're not often thinking about 10 years time. Easier maybe for a founder to say, I'm not
Right.
just in it for the moment, I'm in it for the long term. But I think that's a lovely litmus test to say,
Yeah.
would it shape the way I behave today if I thought further ahead to an ideal end state? And whether your time frame is 10 years or 5 years, I think that mentality is a good one, which is if you only think about solving for the moment, you might wind up creating another problem for yourself. But if you think much further ahead, you can solve for the short term and the long term. It's just a more advantageous position to begin from.
Yeah. Well, and it's, we don't live in an either or world. Like building ambidextrous capabilities is key, right? I often joke with people, I am like the ultimate time traveler because I am living in the past, I'm living in the present, and I'm living in the future all at the same time every day. Now, I recognize it's unique to the nature of my work and what I do day in and day out, but I think there's something to be said for people embracing a little bit of that and being comfortable with that and being able to hold, these two types of thinking skill sets. I mean, you really do, in order to thrive today in sort of the modern business landscape, be able to balance all of these things. Now, it's not easy. I recognize
we call it in our writing, we refer to it as the short-term thinker's blind spot. And it's pretty spot on to what you just said, which is the short-term thinker believes there are only two choices. Hold tight to the past, repeat what was done before exactly like it was done before, because if for any reason it fails, no one's going to blame me for repeating the recipe that worked so well years ago. Versus the other person who says the only choice is cut all ties with the past because it's an anchor that holds me back, and look at making my mark as fast as I can over the next 1 or 2, 3 years to build my resume and get ahead and move on to the next job. So my choice is repeat what's done or destroy everything that was done. And I think the right answer, as you said, is to live in all worlds and resolve the paradox, which is how do you have reverence for where you've been? How do you show an interest in the future? All of which to inspire today. If you look at your past as a compass that points you forward, not an anchor that holds you back, I think you would bring a different sort of point of view in how you navigated the world.
Mm-hmm. Oh, beautifully articulated. There's another metaphor that I'm always using is cooking. When I talk about what I do, because these are all ingredients, exactly what you described. Like look at those experiences as ingredients. And as you move through the world, it's like, all right, what are sort of like put my Michelin star chef hat on? What are some of the innovative ingredients and innovative processes that are coming down the pike? And then what are some of the ingredients that I, used back in the day? And like, what am I currently experimenting with right now? And to kind of bring that together so that you have the recipe that then you can take forward, I think is really important.
Love that. So
I'd love to talk about, you call it making the professional personal, but through the lens of empathy. So future-ready companies anticipate changes and adapt proactively. And empathy is actually really important here because it helps brands understand evolving customer needs and societal shifts. And when you consistently listen to, understand, and sometimes even co-create with customers, you're better equipped to innovate in ways that could align with future expectations. And so this more empathy-driven innovation is essential for maintaining relevance and a competitive advantage. And you've written about the critical role of customer empathy in shaping forward thinking brands, which you call making the professional personal. And so I'm curious, in what ways does empathy shape a brand's future readiness? And maybe what are some surprising or counterintuitive ways leaders might build more lasting value with approaches that are more rooted in empathy?
Sure. One of my favorite stories to tell is about an organization or a brand called Lowe & Sons, started by a mother and her 2 sons. The mother, Helen Lowe, started this business when she was at retirement age. She became a first-time entrepreneur once she had retired in her mid-60s. Mm-hmm. And she solved it very much like I'd shared earlier on in response to she was facing a personal problem and or issue that mattered to her. And in solving for her, she was actually solving a problem that many travelers faced. And the issue was she was limited to the size and nature of the luggage she could bring on an airplane, that the same way we're all limited in how much baggage that we could bring on. But at the time of life, she was traveling with her husband kind of all over the world. And so she had both a need to be able to accommodate, to bring a lot of things with her, but it was important to her that she had a sense of style as well. And so she was looking for the space she required, the functionality that she required, and the aesthetic and the style that she needed as well, particularly for carry-on luggage. And based on her research, she just couldn't find what she needed. And one of her sons, who had some marketing fluency, encouraged her to say, well, if that's your problem, why don't you go see if you can solve it? And it was fascinating. She started doing research on her own. She started talking to other customers of all ages, her peers and cohorts, but people who were younger as well, and discerned they did have the same problem. She did research on form and function and style. She found materials. She found a factory to collaborate with. She built some luggage that basically solved her own need. And not only did she solve for it in the moment, but as you look ahead, it shows you the importance of understanding the problems that you're solving for and being committed to them, because when COVID happened and travel was restricted, they could have very well shut down business and said, I guess people aren't traveling like they did before. They simply don't have need for the things we have. But instead, she took the same approach, which was, well, who are people who are still moving through the world right now? Often they were frontline workers. There were people going to hospitals, for example, and working in those environments that needed the ability to also carry their luggage with them, their daily luggage with them, and had the same desires for things that were functional, but also fashionable, and being very clear about what they were trying to do in the world and understanding that they were working to solve people's problems. They didn't have a business that shut down in response to something that was unexpected. They simply had to reimagine what their ambition or purpose was back then in the context of the world that we were living in. And I thought that was a lovely example of a brand that was very clear on where they were going, the problem they were solving, the people they were solving for, such that in their case, they were more future ready.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what's coming up for me is, I feel like, especially more in the startup ecosystem and companies coming today are very focused on a product or something, I don't know if tactical is the right word, but and this is why I never talk about technology. I'm actually more looking at the fundamental human truths and needs, the elemental needs that we all share, whether that's belonging, whether that's security, whether that's safety. Those to me are the opportunity spaces to sort of focus on, right? And those are where the opportunities sit, where you can create more enduring legacy-like brands, because if that's what your purpose is rooted in, it has more legs. Right. You think about Nike didn't just create running shoes, right? They tapped into this inner desire for self-improvement, performance, identity, and really sort of built this global brand by understanding the emotional journey of the athlete. Yeah. And so that's a company that really tapped into empathy and also zoomed out and said, okay, well, yes, okay, we are coming to market with a shoe. Like, let's not kid ourselves here, yeah. But how can we take a step back as we think about a long-term vision and strategy, and what are those fundamental human needs that we're actually looking to solve? And this running shoe happens to be our first go-to-market product.
Yeah, that reminds me, I shared the story of Low & Son. So they're one example of a brand that participates in the luggage and travel space. Mm-hmm. But if I think about a very iconic brand with a much longer history, would be a brand like Louis Vuitton. So brand starts in the 1800s. Mm-hmm. Fundamentally, they're a luggage brand. So for the physical journeys that people take, Louis Vuitton was making bags that would help you to go from point A to point B. Mm-hmm. Fast forward to many years later in the 2000s. How does the luggage brand behave in a modern context? And their perspective is, well, the journeys that people are taking aren't just physical ones. They're taking emotional journeys as well. So they weren't just there for the point A to point B. They were there for the many journeys that you would take in your life, the emotional journeys, as well as the physical ones. I think it's another lovely example of they didn't have to become a company they never were to compete in the contemporary marketplace. They just had to remember the company they always were to figure out how to navigate the contemporary marketplace.
Yeah, I love that. And I think this empathetic, emotional approach is very future ready in the sense that you don't then necessarily get bogged down in what is trendy, what are the immediate needs. Now, that doesn't mean you can't solve for those as well. That depends on your business and your model. But at the end of the day, if you want to build something that is enduring, if you start building a relationship with people, whoever your customers or clients are, that is rooted in empathy and says, hey, listen, like we're going to go on this journey together. And it's going to be a long journey. And really, at the end of the day, in the example of Nike, we're going to go on the emotional journey of what it means to be an athlete, the highs, the lows, the wins, the disappointments, what you need, the setbacks, the community, all of those things that are actually very emotionally, those aren't functionally related. Those are emotionally related. I think is a really powerful way for leaders to say, okay, well, how can I use empathy-driven approaches to really, build something that is more legacy-like and enduring?
That resonates with me very strongly.
Yeah. So David Bowie once sang, which I will not, cha-cha-cha changes, turn and face the strange. And this really resonates with me deeply because Bowie is commenting on the inevitability of change and how we should meet it head on, even when it's disorienting. And despite the many think pieces and conversations about embracing change, in my experience, is mostly all talk and no walk. And you have written, and I couldn't more agree. And you mentioned this previously, that the paradox of doing business in a short-term world is that having a powerful long-term vision is the best way to ensure your brand is relevant every single day. But I'd be curious to flip this perspective inwards, right? And maybe think about or hear about what maybe gaps or difficulties are you facing when you're anticipating or strategizing for Team One and the Legacy Labs future. So kind of, again, that empathy-driven approach. And what wisdom would you offer for leaders who are maybe struggling with similar challenges?
Sure. There are a couple of thoughts that come to mind that I'll share just based on practical experience. One is something that probably all leaders and organizations can relate to, which is we become very myopic about the world that we live in. So we begin to ask our questions about how other companies to the left and to the right, the ones who compete like we do perceptually, what are they doing? What are their tactics and what are their strategies? And so you very quickly wind up in this game of incrementality where for the moment you might do slightly better than the brand to the left or the right, only to be displaced tomorrow when they also benchmark against you and do slightly better. And so this notion of looking too inward only at your immediate category, I think is part of the problem. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the way forward is to look in a larger context to consider culture beyond categories. And I could give practical examples, which is, I'm sure at one point Sears considered itself to be so big and iconic that no one would ever take it on. I'm sure at one point the world's largest hotel companies looked at themselves and said, we're only comparing to a handful of brands that could play like we do, and had no sense that home rentals and home sharing would become a competitive category in the same way that the automotive industry probably thought there were a handful of key competitors, only to find out that technology companies were now building cars, or ride sharing became as or more important than just buying a car or leasing a car like we always did. Yeah. And so I think the solution in part to being myopic and looking only in category is, as I suggested, being open-minded enough to look in a larger context and look at not just immediate competitors, but look at the most interesting things that are happening in the world all around us. The ones who spotted that people were willing to take rideshare and not own a vehicle were the ones who might say, well, how can we look at things like subscription services and sharing in other industries and categories? And the ones who were savvy enough to realize that what was once a small competitor called Amazon came along and displaces, or certainly heavily competes against a company like Sears, are the ones who understand that people don't want to be limited to the inventory they could find in their brick and mortar. They don't just look at a big store as a superstore. They look at the internet as the world superstore. They can shop anywhere and find anything at any time. And so I think that's one of the most important principles here, which is how do you get future ready? How do you embrace change? How do you get not mired down in the things you do on a daily basis, is being able to take a step back and have a larger purview. The second thing that we do is there's no shortage of organizations that tend to look at their customers simply as people who transact in retail targets. And the first questions we ask would be things like, what are they buying today and why are they buying them? If they're not buying us and a competitor, why are they buying them? And I think in the same way we have to look at categories more deeply by examining culture, I think we have to look at people more deeply by understanding them at the human and value level. If you understand what people care about deeply in life, it's more likely to inform how you adapt and change for the moment. And so it's so fascinating. In our practice, we have a group of what we call vanguards that we talk to on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, not about any specific purchase, but about their values, about elections that are happening, about warfare, about social well-being, about health, and so on. Because when we're faced with product and category specific questions, we can relate it to how people are feeling in the world. And it's often a better leading indicator than to merely copy or imitate what the immediate brands who look like us are doing. So a long answer to say, we tend to look at culture beyond category. We tend to look at people more deeply at the value level, more than just at the transactional level.
I love that. Well, and to start sort of with your first point, the biggest mistake I see are leaders narrowcasting and focusing on the familiar, right? You need to look beyond your industry for insights and inspiration, because sometimes the most groundbreaking ideas come from cross-pollination, right? Whether that's studying nature, art, history, or even entirely different industries can provide perspectives and stimulate innovative thinking. And I love that you brought up the hotel example, because as you were talking, what came up for me is one of the things I love to share around why I believe that technology is tactical and an accelerant is boarding houses have been around since the 1800s. This is not a new concept. So all technology did was enable a new way to transact and to find said boarding houses, if you will. But, something that it dated hundreds of years ago, right, and was a need that people had that is a fundamentally enduring need. We go back to legacy building, right? And so if you focus on those things and not, oh my God, there's this new Gen AI thing, and what can we do with it? To me is completely a backwards approach. And that's why it's so important to start with the humans. And then to your second point around getting to a deeper level, spending time with them, spending time with the people who are already ahead of the curve, right? As you were speaking of your vanguards, I'm like, oh, that sounds like me, because I got my fingers in everything, right? Again, that's why I call myself a holistic futurist, because I'm looking at a lot of different things. Now I have concentration areas that are driven by my passion points, but at the end of the day, I've got my fingers in a lot. And so I think that's really powerful for our listeners is, find these people in whatever way that you can, build relationships with them, tap, what are they talking about? What's exciting them? Because they're actually just living in a future ready world themselves. And so what sort of insights can you get? What are they, what are they struggling with? Right. And if you're actually focusing on those vanguards and what they're, well, guess what? You're already ahead versus, to your point earlier, of looking at something that's already in market and then you become a me too.
Yeah, it's been fascinating because brands across categories, and specific one of them that we work in quite a bit, the idea of, or the category of affluence and luxury and or premium. There was a question coming out of the pandemic, which was at a time when needs became more important than desires and wants, is it going to reset the marketplace for people who aren't going to spend abundantly for things that they see potentially as more wasteful than worthwhile? And instead, what our vanguards were telling us, which was fascinating, was they said, we understand that the world's going to change and that we do need to re-examine our priorities. But no one wants to live in a world that's less good. People don't want things that aren't aspirational, and they don't want to sacrifice on the idea of dreaming. And so they were looking for new solutions, but to satisfy timely solutions, to satisfy a timeless ideal, which is they still wanted to dream. So what is that timely expression of a timeless value? And they started to actually become incredibly creative about how they were looking at the world, creating new solutions for themselves, and even getting to the point where they'd say, well, if brands can't keep up with us, we don't need to wait for brands. We will invent our own solutions. And as you say, technology is an enabler of that. So I find it really worthwhile to talk to the people who are on the leading edge of how's their life evolving, because that informs so many brand choices and decisions.
Yeah, I love that. It just like gave me goosebumps. It was beautifully articulated. And I think, some other things that are just coming up for me as we bring ourselves to a close is I think, failing to act. This is what people don't get most. You and we're the misfit outlier anomalies on this, but failing to act. Well, I'm actually speaking for myself, but like I sense some of those words might resonate with you, but failing to act on the long term can create short-term pain, right? Because it leaves your company vulnerable to unexpected challenges and disruptions. And when you focus only on the immediate needs, you miss the opportunities to innovate, improve efficiency, adapt to future changes, but also what people don't understand is this reactive approach often results in higher costs, lost market share, and a lack of preparedness. And as a result, your companies may face crisis management, hurried fixes, diminished competitive advantages, all leading to more significant struggles in your day-to-day today.
Exactly.
Right? And then I also remind people that to boot, research has shown that spending time in the future mentally actually reduces anxiety. Like they've studied this. And so if you were feeling anxious or I don't want to go there or it feels too overwhelming, I hate to tell you, but as Robert Frost said, the only way out is through. And by being intentional and even just spending a little bit of time more on a continuous basis, according to the research, medical research, your anxiety about the unexpected will actually decrease.
Yeah. We came across an interesting concept, which has been well documented and written about. The concept is the Japanese concept of, I'm originally Canadian, so I would say ikigai, but I'm sure the way I should say it is ikigai.
Yeah.
And it's a lovely point of view, which is some people figure it out quickly. And for some people, it takes a long time to figure it out, but it effectively has 4 simple questions where if over the course of your lifetime, you can answer them, helps you get very clear on your reason for being. And the perspective is when you're very clear on what's at the heart of your reason for being, it'll help you to move through life. It helps you to look long-term in a short-term world. It helps you to face difficult decisions with greater confidence. And the questions are really simple. It's the first one is, what do you love? Because if you're working on something you love, you'll put in tremendous energy and effort into doing it. Separately, what are you good at? Because more than just loving it, if you're good at it, you might be successful for some short period of time. The third is, what can you be paid for? Because even if it's a not-for-profit endeavor, you need to be able to raise funds to sustain your not-for-profit. And the fourth is, what are you contributing to the world that the world needs in abundance that is otherwise in rare supply? Because if you can offer that, something the world needs abundantly that isn't commonly available, not only will you succeed for a short amount of time, but you can sustain that for a lifetime. And I think that's a lovely sort of organizing idea for people who say, I sign up for the idea, emotionally sign up for the idea of wanting to think and act this way, but where do I turn and what can I do today or tomorrow? And I think the ikigai concept is a simple one, which is ask yourself those questions, see if you can articulate them for yourselves, and then revisit it. I'd do it every year. I would say, do you still feel strongly about this? Is it still your passion? And I don't think the outcome is you have to change what you're working on every 12 months. But I like the idea that if you're very clear on what you're pursuing over a lifetime, you'll make better choices and decisions for you personally and your organization even today.
I love that. And, it's funny. So the Ikigai framework is actually one of the frameworks that inspired my framework that I use when helping leaders and companies envision their long-term strategy, because I think the question approach is a really powerful one because it puts you in a mindset of more open space exploration. And so there are 4 questions that I ask, and the Ikigai, as you use it to get sort of sorted personally, I start with a question of what could be the major sources of disruption and change, right? So to our point, get outside of that narrow casting and focusing on the familiar, get everything out on the table. even things that you don't think could be remotely relevant to your business today. Like, what could those be? Then, because my personal belief is that strategy is subjective and there's no such thing as an objective strategy. And so the second question I ask it is, what is calling you now? So to the point of what's your purpose? What do you feel, what's your company's purpose? Where do you feel like you can have an impact? How do you want to be intentional about it? Then the question I ask is, what do you sense could be the secret ingredients? And that's really rooted in what are maybe early indicators, what are weak, emerging, things that are under the radar that when you bake the cake, as I like to say, when you're pulling these secret ingredients, what are the outliers and anomalies? What are the things from the past? Again, this is why I love the recipe metaphor. What could be the secret ingredients that are your value proposition and competitive advantage? And then what do you sense the world could be ready for? And those are the paradigm shifts, right? And where the mindsets are changing and evolving that represent the opportunity spaces and the places in the market where you could actually be ahead of the game.
I really, really like that. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. So is there anything else that you would like to add before we bring our conversation to a close?
The only thing that I'd reflect upon is in doing my work, and maybe there are two things. One is to reiterate something I shared earlier. I think there are people who see a false choice here, which is I can be a person who thinks long-term and make a difference, or I can be a person who thinks short-term and make a profit. And I don't think it's an either or proposition. And I think that's a false choice.
Agreed.
I think you can work on things that you care about. I think you can have something that matters to you in life, whatever that might be. It doesn't always have to be change the world. It could be change something small. It doesn't have to be change something big,
right,
or improve something small. So I think that's really important. And I love the idea of whether it's the Taylor Guitars quote or some, whatever your version of is, ask yourself in years from now, if you did this, would you feel better off for it? Because you shared something earlier, which is often fear and or risk gets in the way of people making choices and decisions. Mm-hmm. And if you knew that you'd be better off for doing it, could you get yourself over the hurdle now? And I think that's a lovely way, easier said than done, but I think that's a good mindset to have as you're confronted with difficult choices and decisions in your life. Yes, people can endure the short term because they think there's a short-term benefit. But if you could succeed today, tomorrow, and always by making a different choice, is that not a better way to go? And so I think I would end on those two thoughts.
Love that. And that brings me to my final questions for you before you share where our listeners can find out more about you and your book and your company. So in your view, is preparing for the future more about managing risks or capitalizing on opportunities?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I wish I could tell you that's a forced choice. And I think there's actually a combination of the two, but I will play. And if I had to pick,
no, you don't. That's why it's a trick question. It tells me a lot about my guest. So it's, oh my God, I'm asking him this question. And it just.
I think it's a forced choice. I'm not sure you have to look at it that way. I would say based on the people that I've interviewed, there's probably a greater predisposition for people who actually begin with, I was trying to solve something greater than the opposite. So whether it was Yvonne Chouinard wanting to create a world that you move through without leaving a trace, or whether it's the team at Taylor Guitars, I don't think they look at it as how much of a risk would it be. I think they tend to take a more optimistic point of view. So while I think it's a forced choice and both things need to be considered, it is also true that there are a number of people that I've met who would tell you pursuing opportunity with optimism has worked very well for them.
Yes, totally. Well, it is funny because I've actually never answered this question on my show, but I agree that it is a false choice. And that part of why I ask it is because I think it is actually both. And I would say of the 30-ish people I've interviewed to date, that's why I was actually giggling. So, because I was like, oh my gosh, here we go. I have a feeling he's going to say, no, it's both. Is because I definitely am in the camp. I think I've had 2 other people so far on the show be like, no, it's both. So, very interesting.
We touched on it briefly and maybe a topic for another day.
Yeah.
But we ultimately found that we had to create a new quantitative metric to help long-term decision makers succeed within their own organizations. So that even though Patagonia moves optimistically in making choices, Taylor Guitars moves optimistically in making choices, as companies grow and scale and the stakeholders increase, and sometimes private companies become public companies,
right?
The quantification of this matters. And those are the people who, in a sense, are looking to mitigate risk.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And I would definitely love to dig into that topic and many more, because Mark, I had 3 more meaty questions for you. So, and with that, where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
Sure. 3 places. On LinkedIn, you find me. My name is Mark, M-A-R-K, Miller, M-I-L-L-E-R. I'm the one that has a picture of my book in the header, which is Legacy in the Making. You can find me at my company and organization, which is called Team One, and the website is Team1, TEAMONE-USA.com. And actually, you can find some of Team One's related work about the Legacy Lab on thelegacylab.com.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time and your brilliant insights, Mark. It has been enlightening, and I have had so much fun exploring with you today. We will definitely be doing this again, I hope.
Thank you, Regan.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Future Fit. If you're listening, you're probably future curious. So follow me in my newsletter on LinkedIn to keep the conversation going and share your discoveries with the Future Fit community. And if you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe, rate, and review Future Fit on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time.